On this vote, the yeas are 74 and the nays are 25. Pursuant to the previous order, the amendment having attained 60 votes in the affirmative, the amendment is agreed to.
The U.S. Senate voted overwhelmingly in favor of the $700 billion financial sector bailout package. The vote came late Wednesday night after Senate leaders from both sides agreed to add $110 billion in tax breaks for businesses in the middle class, plus a provision to raise from $100,000 to $250,000 the cap on federal deposit insurance. Republican John McCain and Democrat Barack Obama made rare appearances to cast aye votes.
Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Obama. Mr. Obama, aye.
Earlier, both presidential candidates had urged their fellow senators to get behind the resurrected financial bailout bill, saying it was necessary to stabilize the economy.
This plan is not perfect. Democrats and Republicans in Congress have legitimate concerns about it. I know many Americans share these concerns. It is clear, though, that this is what we have to do right now to prevent a crisis from turning into a catastrophe.
If the financial rescue bill fails in Congress yet again, the present crisis will turn into a disaster.
Even as the Senate voted, leaders in the House of Representatives were hunting for the 12 votes they would need to turn around Monday's 228 to 205 defeat. In the Senate, 9 Democrats, 15 Republicans, and 1 independent voted against the bill.
Mr. President, I strongly oppose this legislation. It takes our country in the wrong direction. It forces innocent taxpayers to bail out government policies and Wall Street mistakes. It asks the American people to take a leap of faith and trust people who have consistently misled them.
The independent, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, had proposed an amendment that would see a 10% surtax on those with an income over $500,000 or $1 million a year for couples, raising $300 billion in revenues over 5 years.
This bill does not deal with the absurdity of having the fox guarding the henhouse. Now, maybe I'm the only person in America who thinks so, but I have a hard time understanding why we are giving $700 billion to the Secretary of the Treasury, who was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who, along with other financial institutions, actually got us into this problem.
The Real News senior editor Paul Jay spoke to Ellen Frank, professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts.
Welcome, Ellen.
Well, hello, Paul.
So firstly, when this bill was originally, or proposal was originally handed by Paulson to Congress, it was 3 pages long, and apparently now it's grown to 451 pages long. At any rate, is this 451 pages any better than what Congress rejected?
It's essentially the same bill. I mean, the only difference is that they've added a provision to increase deposit insurance from $100,000 to $250,000. And they've laden it with all sorts of tax breaks for businesses.
During the debate, Bernie Sanders said that this could be paid for with a relatively small tax increase. Individuals over $500,000, families over $1 million, but no one took him very seriously. The idea of raising taxes to deal with this amongst the wealthy seems to be a non-starter.
Well, you know, one of the things that right now, and the thing that most concerns me about this bill, I mean, everybody is holding their nose in voting for this bill. My big fear is that going into January, when we are faced with this huge expenditure, not only, you know, with all the problems of this bill, all the problems of the unfairness of this bill, all the problems of the lack of restrictions on executive pay and on shareholder profits and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we are going to be faced with the kind of deficit politics that have crippled public policy in this country for the last generation, that whoever is president, you know, whoever is in Congress is going to come into the next legislative session with the media and Wall Street and, you know, the conservative economists saying, oh my God, we're facing $1 trillion deficit. We cannot afford healthcare reform. We cannot afford green energy policies. We cannot afford infrastructure repair.
If you look at 1929, as most of us understand it, a financial crisis, financial collapse led to a massive depression rather than a cyclical recession. And we're getting the same argument now, that this credit, the paralysis of the credit market, and we're being told that local banks won't be able to loan mortgages and people won't be able to buy cars, and we're given a long list of how this will lead to a 1930s style period. Are we looking at that or not?
I don't think we will ever see anything in the United States like a 1930s style period. We are not going to see 25% unemployment rates. We are not going to see bread lines. Because we have social safety nets in place now. We have government fiscal policies in place now. We have a Federal Reserve System in place now that we did not have in place in the 1930s. So that's not a problem. I mean, that does not mean that we will not face serious recessionary pressures, serious problems with unemployment, and serious problems in the credit market. It doesn't mean that we couldn't face the kind of problem that Japan faced in the 1990s of extremely sluggish growth.
People like Dean Baker, an economist in Washington, and others are saying, who cares if the banks fail? If you do need to stimulate the economy, which I think he thinks you do, you can put the money directly into the economy in terms of infrastructure investment. You can finance liquidity in ways other than the big banks. And here's a little quote from Dean I'll play from another interview we carried.
There might be nothing bad that happens. We're in a recession. We're in a recession because we lost $4 to $5 trillion in housing bubble wealth. The financial markets are absolutely strained. Some big banks have gone under. Many more almost certainly will. But from the standpoint of the public, and from that vantage point, the standpoint of the economy, we don't need the big banks. That's not our problem. We could keep the financial system operating. That's what we care about. The fact that banks go under, that's bad news for the bank executives, who get paid tens of millions of dollars, by the way. It's bad news for the shareholders who are going to lose all their money in those banks. For the rest of us, we have no particular interest in that.
So, Ellen, do you agree with Dean? Who cares if the big banks fail?
Well, I think it matters if bank after bank after bank fails. I do think that the government should take action through the Federal Reserve and perhaps through the Treasury Department, but it doesn't have to take this kind of action, and it doesn't have to take action with so little deliberation and so little thought and so much taxpayer money at risk. We could take an equity stake in these firms. We could recapitalize the firms and take a public ownership stake in these firms until they are solvent again and until they are ready to stand on their own. That would be in the taxpayers' interest.
One of the things that's being talked about is the profound growing lack of confidence in the U.S. dollar around the world. And that if China, Russia, and other countries, especially those two, but others that are holding a lot of American debt, if they decide that the American deficit debt is way too high, that the United States is just printing money to bail itself out, and the dollar gets so debased that people start to bail on the dollar, are we looking at something far more profound?
That's one of the reasons why a better way to do this would be to have the Federal Reserve buy up these toxic assets off the government's balance sheet and not issue new debt to do it, and save the issuing of new debt for things that we really need in this country.
If the Federal Reserve buys this up, who pays?
That's one of the things the Federal Reserve.
They print money. But that's what I'm saying, is that if the bailout is based on just printing more money, then and the rest of the world decides this is getting to be less than worthy paper, and does that, perhaps, do we see a run on the U.S. dollar, and then where does that lead?
Right now, the U.S. dollar and holding U.S. dollar, short-term U.S. dollar assets, things like Treasury bills and U.S. cash, is considered to be the safest thing around for the U.S. financial system. People are holding this with the promise of virtually no interest, simply because it's safer than the alternative, which is holding the debt of private institutions who are in danger of failing.
So to sum up, you don't think we're not looking into the abyss, and we're seeing scaremongering in terms of the pushing of this bill?
I think we're seeing a lot of scaremongering. I agree with Dean that Wall Street has put a gun to the head of the U.S. Congress.
Actually, Dean said they put a gun to their own head and are threatening to pull the trigger.
Right, I think he misspoke, but
no, it's a scene from Blazing Saddles. The sheriff is surrounded. The black sheriff is surrounded by a white lynch mob who are about to kill him, and he puts a gun to his own head and says, if you take one more step, I'm going to blow my brains out, and they all step back. And I think he's playing on that imagery, I think. We'll see what happens in Congress this week, whether Congress agrees with what Senate has done. It's not over yet. Thanks so much for joining us, Ellen.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for joining us.